I'm Brittany, 34, CEO of a billion-dollar startup I built from scratch. I flew in for my father's 60th birthday thinking maybe this time I'd finally belong. But instead of joining the family table, they sat me alone. Outside. One chair. One candle. One cold silence. Jason said there wasn't enough room, the maitre d' whispered. I smiled through the burn. The cold wasn't from the breeze. It was from knowing I was never meant to be inside. Then my phone lit up, a $1.6 billion deal waiting for my call. That night, I didn't just leave dinner, I walked out of the story they wrote for me. When I received the invitation to my father's 60th birthday dinner, I told myself it was just another formal family obligation. A black tie evening at Le Bernardin, the kind of place where the napkins cost more than my first month's rent during startup days. But deep down I hoped this time might be different. I was 34, CEO of a tech company valued at just under $1 billion. Nexus Technologies wasn't just a success story, it was mine. Every sleepless night, every bank rejection, every backhanded compliment I endured from my own family had led to something tangible. Something powerful. And still I hoped. Hope is dangerous that way. It makes you buy the nice dress. It makes you show up on time. It makes you think maybe this time they'll see you. Really see you. When I arrived, the maitre d' greeted me with the kind of smooth efficiency I used to fake in investor meetings. "Good evening, Miss Morgan," he said, glancing at his tablet. "Your party has arrived. If you'll follow me." The dining room was glowing, filled with soft laughter, crystal stemware, and the low hum of men in suits talking business. I spotted my family instantly, my father at the head of the table, my mother beside him, looking like she belonged in a Ralph Lauren ad, and my brother Jason leaning in to whisper something smug into her ear. But the maitre d' didn't take me to them. Instead, he led me past the glittering dining room, through a side hallway and out onto the patio. A small table. One chair, one place setting. One flickering candle struggling against the evening breeze. "Excuse me," I said, stopping in my heels. "There must be a mistake." "That's not. I'm with the Reynolds party." His eyes flicked away awkwardly. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Jason Reynolds specifically requested you be seated out here." "I'm very sorry." I stood there for a beat, too long absorbing it. The air was warmer than I expected, but somehow I felt cold. Jason stepped through the patio doors, a champagne flute in hand. "There you are, Britt," he said with that saccharine tone he reserves for public humiliation. "Thought maybe you bailed again." "Why am I out here?" I asked evenly. He shrugged. "We had a bit of a space issue. Dad invited more partners than expected, and well, the patio's for people who don't have anything real to contribute to the conversation." He smiled as if that line were clever. As if it didn't cut as deeply as it always had. "You mean the patio's for failures," I said, my voice low. "If the shoe fits," he replied, raising his glass. "But hey, great view, right?" He left before I could answer. I sat down slowly, careful not to let the heaviness in my chest show on my face. A waiter arrived, clearly mortified to be assigned to the outcast table. "Would you care for something to drink, Miss Morgan?" he asked gently. "Yes," I said, staring through the glass doors at the family I'd somehow never belonged to. "Bring me the most expensive bottle of Bordeaux you have. And please don't hold back on the pour." As I sat there listening to the muffled laughter from inside, I couldn't help but watch them. My mother perfectly poised. My father animated and commanding, telling stories to his banking cronies. And Jason, God. Jason soaking up all the attention, the legacy, the validation that I had never been offered. Not even now. Not after everything I'd built. I'd brought my company back from the brink 3 times. I'd created jobs, led innovation, made headlines, but to them I was still the girl with the little startup. Still the misfit who didn't go to Harvard. Still, the daughter who made things awkward at family events by insisting she had a real career. I picked at the amuse-bouche the waiter delivered. Some delicate sea thing with foam and edible flowers. It tasted like ash in my mouth. I was halfway through my second glass of Bordeaux when my phone buzzed. Normally I don't check messages during family dinners. But then again, I wasn't really part of the family dinner, was I? It was Thomas, my CFO. 3 texts in rapid succession, urgent. TechCorp just made a formal bid for DataSphere. They're offering 1.4 B all cash. We need to respond tonight. CEO wants to talk to you directly. Call ASAP. I read the texts twice, pulse quickening. This wasn't just a development. It was the development. The acquisition we'd been working on for months, the one that would catapult Nexus into a whole new league, was at risk of slipping away. If we wanted to win, we'd have to move. Fast. I looked up from my phone past the glass at my family. They were raising a toast. To Dad, probably. To legacy. To institutions that always looked like him and never like me. They had no idea what was happening on the other side of that glass. No idea I was about to walk away from their table again. But this time I wouldn't be walking. I reached into my clutch and texted my pilot. Pick me up, Central Park, 20 mins. Then I set my phone down beside my half-finished wine and breathed out slowly. They had no idea my helicopter was already en route, and for the first time in my life, I wouldn't be leaving quietly. As I sat on that patio watching my family clink glasses behind spotless glass, my mind drifted not just to the deal that might define my company's future, but to the past that had always tried to define me. I didn't always feel like an outsider. Not at first. We lived in Wellesley, Massachusetts, one of those polished, ivy-draped suburbs where everything looked curated right down to the hedges. My father, Stephen Morgan, was the executive vice president at Hamilton Barrington Bank. The bank, as people in our neighborhood called it. He wore suits like armor and spoke in firm, well-structured sentences, even at breakfast. To the outside world, he was a financial titan. To me, he was a wall I kept trying to scale. My mother, Helen, was his elegant reflection. Always composed, always dressed like she had somewhere more important to be. She organized charity galas, hosted brunches for the wives of her husband's colleagues, and smiled through everything like the right kind of woman should. She wasn't unkind, but she deferred. Always to him. And then there was Jason. 4 years older. Captain of the debate team. Varsity tennis. Future Harvard man. He'd been wearing suits and quoting Warren Buffett since he was 12. Jason was born for the life my parents had charted. He didn't have to earn their approval. He was born wearing it like a tailored jacket. I, on the other hand, broke things. Not out of malice, out of curiosity. When I was 9, I took apart the family VCR because I wanted to know how the tape worked. Dad was livid. Mom tried to hide a smile and told me to apologize. Jason stood behind Dad, shaking his head like he was embarrassed for me. At 10, I asked for a soldering kit for Christmas. I didn't get it. I got a pink sweater set and a beginner's calligraphy kit instead. At 12, I taught myself basic HTML and coded a digital birthday card for my mom. The flowers bloomed across the screen and played a soft piano tune I composed myself. That's cute, she said. But you still need to go outside more. My father didn't even look up from his Wall Street Journal. Computers are fine for hobbies, Brittany, he said. Real careers are built in finance, law, or medicine. Preferably finance. Jason, of course, agreed. You can always work in tech support if it doesn't pan out, he said, grinning. By high school, the path had forked. Jason was already tutoring younger students in economics and lining up his summer internship at Dad's bank. I was building websites for local bakeries and fixing teachers' laptops in exchange for used books. Jason was the son who would carry on the family name. I was an outlier. The one who needed air quotes around her success. Our daughter Brittany is very bright, Dad would say to his friends at dinners. She's into tech things. One time I overheard him tell a colleague at a barbecue. She didn't get into Harvard, but MIT is still respectable. Good for engineers. Very technical, he said it like a concession. Like I'd lost the family game, but at least I hadn't embarrassed them. MIT for me was heaven. It was the first place I felt like I wasn't weird for the way my brain worked. I double majored in computer science and business. I made Dean's List every semester. I co-founded a student-led innovation lab that landed actual VC interest before graduation. But back home, at my graduation dinner, my father gave a toast. A long one. He praised Jason's mentorship. Thanked him for guiding his quirky little sister through the years. called me relentlessly curious, which sounded almost like a flaw. Everyone laughed. I smiled politely and sipped my wine. Even then I knew I could code circles around Jason, but I'd always be sitting outside the metaphorical table in this family. The Harvard table. The real table. The one that mattered. The table where Dad and Jason spoke in deal terms and equity ratios, while I tried to explain what scalable architecture meant and watched their eyes glaze over. Sometimes I wondered if they would have understood me more if I'd been a son. If my love for building things, solving systems, and challenging ideas would have been seen as strength instead of strangeness. But I was a daughter. And in my family, daughters were supposed to decorate the room, not disrupt it. Once when I was 19, I overheard my father on the phone with a colleague talking about Jason's internship. Jason said proudly, "He'll take over my office one day, no doubt. Brittany, she's experimenting. But she'll come around. Probably marry some engineer and settle down. God willing." That night, I stayed awake until sunrise scribbling notes for a startup idea that would later become the backbone of Nexus Technologies. It wasn't rage that kept me up, it was resolve. I didn't want to sit at their table anymore. I wanted to build my own. Now, years later, sitting on that patio exiled again, I realized just how long that feeling had lived in me. They hadn't changed, but I had. I wasn't the girl breaking VCRs anymore. I was the woman closing billion-dollar deals. And as my phone buzzed again with updates from my team, I smiled to myself. The girl they never thought would amount to anything was about to become the reason they'd remember this night forever. When I got my acceptance letter to MIT, I cried. Not just because it was one of the best engineering schools in the world, but because I thought naively that maybe this was the moment my father would finally look at me with something close to pride. He didn't laugh her skulls, so 80 or something. He folded the letter with clinical neatness, set it down next to his coffee and said, "Well, at least you didn't flunk out of high school." That was his idea of encouragement. Jason had already secured early admission to Harvard by then, of course. The day his letter arrived, my mother threw a dinner party. My father uncorked a bottle of wine he'd been saving since the early 90s. Jason got a new watch. I got a seat at the kids' table. I still remember what he said that night while swirling his wine in that smug, perfect way. "We're a Harvard family now." I wanted to say, "No, you're a Jason family. The rest of us are just extras." But I kept quiet. I always kept quiet. MIT was electric. There I wasn't weird, I was just early. I found people who thought in code and dreamed in systems. I double majored in computer science and business, slept maybe 4 hours a night, and lived on ambition and cold coffee. I joined hackathons, led teams, built things that actually worked. I was thriving. But back home, none of it translated. Dad would introduce me to his business associates like I was some quirky pet. "This is Brittany," he'd say. "She's doing computer stuff at MIT." Sometimes they'd nod politely. Sometimes they'd ask if I could fix their printer. Jason, on the other hand, was already working summers at Dad's bank giving TED Talk-style updates about market trends, IPO potentials, and how the world would be saved by bonds and spreadsheets. At family dinners, I'd try to talk about the AI project I was leading or the pitch I gave to a Boston VC firm. The room would fall into an awkward silence. Jason would change the subject. My mom would refill wine glasses. Dad would say, "That's nice, Britt," and ask Jason how the markets were reacting to the latest Fed announcement. I wasn't invisible. But I was irrelevant. Graduation rolled around. I invited them, of course. I told myself maybe this time it would be different. That they'd sit in the crowd and clap for me and really see me. They came. All 3 of them. Dressed impeccably like they were attending someone else's success. The ceremony was long. My name was called. I walked across the stage with honors, shook the dean's hand, and looked out over the crowd, hoping just for a second to find my father's face. I didn't. He was looking at his phone. Later that evening, we went out for dinner at an upscale seafood place Jason had picked. When the server brought champagne to toast, my father stood up to make a speech. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate both of our children. Jason, who continues to make us proud at Harvard, and Brittany, who's found her own way. He smiled, lifted his glass, and added, "And let's not forget how helpful Jason has been to his little sister along the way. Every odd duck needs a steady hand." They laughed. I smiled and swallowed something sharp and familiar. Odd duck. Not brilliant, not bold, not even capable, just odd. That night in the Uber back to my apartment, I sat with my dress bunched under me and my diploma still in my lap. I stared out the window and let the streetlights blur into each other like tears I refused to shed. I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired of trying to earn something that would never be given. Love, maybe. Or just the kind of respect they so freely handed to Jason. And the worst part, it wasn't just that they didn't understand what I'd built. It was that they didn't want to. Because what I did didn't fit into their script. I didn't go to Harvard. I didn't follow in Dad's footsteps. I didn't smile and nod and pretend their world was the only one worth living in. I built my own world. And that terrified them. In the months that followed, I turned down 6 high-paying job offers. Every one of them promised prestige, structure, a ladder I could climb. And every one of them felt like a cage. Instead, I called Stephanie, my roommate, my sounding board, my ride or die, and said, "Let's do it." Do what she asked. Build something that doesn't need anyone's permission. That was the beginning of Nexus Technologies. The beginning of the rest of my life. But at that moment, all I had was an idea, a blank whiteboard, and the fire of being underestimated. Again. By the people who should have known better. And yet even then, I still wanted to believe that one day they'd see. That one day MIT would be enough. That I would be enough. I didn't know yet that the road ahead would be filled with 2 a.m. breakdowns, maxed out credit cards, and boardrooms full of men who looked like my father and dismissed me like Jason. But I did know one thing. If they weren't going to offer me a seat at the table, then I'd build one of my own. And someday they'd have to watch from outside the glass. There's a moment right after you say no to the safe path when the silence is deafening. I remember it vividly. The day I turned down my 6th job offer, my inbox was full of polite confusion. "Are you sure? This is a rare opportunity. You'll regret walking away from this package." Maybe they were right. Maybe I was walking away from stability, from prestige, from everything my family would finally respect. But I wasn't looking for their version of success. I was looking for something real. Something I could build with my own hands. Stephanie was the only person who didn't question me. We'd met in our sophomore year dorm at MIT. She was a mechanical engineer who coded better than most CS majors and swore like a sailor. Where I was cerebral and introverted, she was bold, chaotic brilliance. Our friendship was forged over late-night debugging marathons, vending machine dinners, and mutual exhaustion. When I told her I wanted to start something new, something ours, she didn't blink. "When do we start?" she asked, already pulling out a notepad. Nexus Technologies began in a 400 square foot apartment with 3 desks, 2 fans, and 1 shared dream. We had nothing but an idea: build smarter, adaptive business software that didn't treat users like idiots. Our first prototype crashed more times than it ran, but we kept going. Because that's what you do when no one believes in you. You believe harder. Back home, the news didn't land well. "You turned down Goldman," my father said, his voice like gravel, "for a startup." My mother looked heartbroken. "Maybe try it for a year, darling. Just to get it out of your system." Jason laughed. "Let me guess, you and your friend are going to change the world with an app. Don't forget to include a tip jar for when it flops." Every time he opened his mouth, it was like being poked with a diamond-tipped insult. Their reactions didn't surprise me. What hurt was how predictable it was. How little they asked about what we were building, why it mattered, or what problems we were solving. To them, it wasn't a real job. It was a phase. A hobby. I stopped updating them after a while. It felt easier to fail without their gaze on me. Those early days were brutal. There were weeks we didn't know if we could pay rent. We ate ramen for dinner 5 nights a week, split 1 MetroCard between us, and slept on yoga mats in the office to save time. The only thing we had in abundance was belief. And each other. Stephanie was my mirror, my challenger, my anchor. When I doubted myself, she reminded me who I was. When the backend broke at 3 a.m., she was there cursing at the server like it had personally offended her. One night after our fourth pitch rejection in a row, we walked back to the office in the rain, soaked, tired, and holding a single umbrella that had half collapsed. "Do you ever wonder if maybe we are crazy?" I asked. She looked at me like I'd grown another head. "Of course we're crazy. You have to be crazy to try and build something no one's built before. But that's the whole damn point." Then she added, "Besides, if we don't believe in us, who will?" That became our mantra. If we don't believe in us, who will? Meanwhile, Jason had moved into a sleek condo downtown and bought a Porsche. His LinkedIn glowed with promotions. My mother forwarded me screenshots like they were baby photos. Jason's been invited to speak at the Chamber of Commerce. Jason's article got published in Forbes. Jason's company just did a merger. Isn't that exciting? She never asked how Nexus was doing. Only if I was taking care of myself. That's how it is when you're the disappointment wrapped in potential. They check on your sleep schedule, not your success. There was one night I'll never forget. The AC in our office broke during a heat wave. We were knee-deep in bug testing and the software kept crashing every 40 minutes. Stephanie was sitting cross-legged on the floor fanning herself with a manila folder and talking to the code like it was a stubborn child. I looked around at the chaos, empty ramen cups, Post-its everywhere, a whiteboard full of question marks and arrows, and for some reason I felt like crying. Not because I was losing, but because I realized I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had someone who didn't just see me. She stood beside me. We finally got our first break 6 months later. A small business owner desperate for better inventory tools agreed to try our beta. When it worked, he cried. Literally cried. Told us we'd saved his family business. We stayed up until 5 a.m. drinking warm beer and eating gas station cupcakes to celebrate. No press release, no headlines, just the knowledge that we had built something that mattered. It was enough. For now. By the end of that first year, Nexus was still tiny. But it was alive. And that was more than most could say. Jason sent me a birthday card with a Starbucks gift card and a note that read, "Hope the startup is still starting." I didn't respond. Instead, I opened a new spreadsheet, named it Phase 2, Scaling, and got back to work. We weren't winning yet. But we were moving. And every ramen dinner, every landlord warning, every missed holiday gathering wasn't a setback. It was a seed. And one day the world would see the roots we'd planted. Because, while they were dining at tables set for legacy, we were building the table we wanted to sit at. From scratch. By the time Nexus reached its third year, we weren't just surviving, we were scaling. We closed our first major funding round at $8.2 million. Hired real staff. Moved out of the crumbling shared workspace into our first real office, complete with doors that didn't stick and a coffee machine that didn't need prayer to work. Then came the day that changed everything. A Fortune 500 company signed on to license our platform. A name so big even my father couldn't pretend he hadn't heard of them. Stephanie burst into our office waving the signed contract like a flag of war. "We did it," she gasped. They said yes. We screamed. We danced. We cried. We ordered sushi that wasn't on sale. It felt like crossing some invisible threshold, the moment your dream stops being cute and starts being real. I called my parents that evening. It felt important, like maybe this time I could say something that would be met with awe. Or at the very least acknowledgement. "Wow," my mother said. "That sounds exciting. I'm not sure I totally understand what the software does, but likely just a diversity initiative. Checking boxes." I blinked. "That's not what this is," I said quietly. "Of course," he replied, distracted. "I'm just saying timing is everything in tech." But the worst comment came at Thanksgiving. We'd flown back to Boston. It was cold, gray, and thick, with that kind of family tension that clings to the walls no matter how well you smile. Jason had recently been promoted to managing director at the bank. He'd brought a new girlfriend, Amanda, polished professional, as if selected from a catalog titled Wall Street Wives. After dinner, we sat in the living room. Jason poured himself a scotch, glanced at me over the rim of his glass, and said, "So I hear your company got a big contract." "Yes," I said, keeping it short. I learned not to elaborate. It gave him more ammunition. He smirked. "Let me guess they wanted a woman-led firm for their PR push. Checks all the boxes." I'd say congrats, but we both know what the game is. It wasn't even subtle. It was a direct gut punch dressed in business casual. I wanted to snap back. To list every feature we'd built. Every client metric. Every round of due diligence. But I didn't. Because men like Jason aren't interested in facts. They're interested in reminders that the world is built in their image and that anyone who doesn't fit that mold must have cheated their way in. I didn't say a word. I just sipped my wine and looked at my mother, hoping for what exactly? A soft protest. That's not fair, but she just smiled nervously and changed the subject. It was in that moment I realized they wouldn't see me no matter how high I climbed. Not unless I did it their way. Harvard. Finance. Fraternity. Familiarity. But I wasn't playing that game. I was building a different one. Back at work, we were on fire. We opened a second office in Chicago, then a third in San Francisco. Our team doubled, then tripled. Investors started calling us instead of the other way around. Stephanie and I made the cover of Tech Forward with the headline "Disruption with Discipline: The Women Rewriting Enterprise Software." We got invited to speak at panels. Universities asked us to mentor female founders. I was finally standing in the light I had built for myself. And still at Christmas, my father asked, "How's that little software thing going?" Not company, not business. Thing. Jason, of course, got a Crystal Award from the bank for leadership excellence. It now sat prominently on the fireplace mantel. A shrine to a life they understood. There was a kind of cruelty in their dismissal, not violent, not loud. Just persistent erosion. A slow, quiet chipping away that made you feel like your accomplishments were only almost impressive. Almost valid. Almost enough. One night back in New York, I sat with Stephanie on the roof of our building after a late product rollout. We shared a bottle of cheap red wine and watched the skyline buzz with light. "Do you ever think I asked that no matter what we do there's a table we'll never be invited to?" She tilted her head. "No," she said. "I think they're just terrified we're building something bigger than their table could ever hold." I laughed. "You always know what to say." She grinned. "Well, someone's gotta remind you you're a badass when your family pretends you're still playing pretend." And that was it, wasn't it? I wasn't being underestimated because I failed. I was being underestimated because I succeeded in a way they didn't recognize. In a way they didn't control. In a way that didn't require their permission. To them, I was an outlier. To me, I was finally becoming undeniable. The invitation arrived in early May, thick and cream-colored, embossed with gold foil lettering. It looked more like a wedding announcement than a birthday dinner. "You are cordially invited to the 60th birthday celebration of Stephen Morgan. Black tie optional. Le Bernardin, New York City." My name was written in my mother's delicate cursive, Brittany Ann Morgan. I stared at it for a long time. There it was again, that small, persistent flicker. Hope. I hated that I still felt it. After everything. After years of polite condescension, of being talked over and talked down to, of watching Jason celebrated for breathing while I had to move mountains just to be tolerated. Still, some part of me, some rusted, naive part, hoped this might be different. Maybe turning 60 had softened my father. Maybe they'd seen the article in Forbes. Maybe someone at his club had mentioned the rising star named Brittany Morgan and he'd finally started connecting the dots. Maybe for once they'd see me not as an exception, but as someone who belonged. I didn't RSVP right away. I let the card sit on my counter for 2 days before I called Stephanie. "You're not going," she said the moment I told her. "It's his 60th. So what? You think this time the ballroom doors will magically open and there'll be a red carpet with a sign that says we were wrong?" "No," I admitted. "But maybe they'll finally look me in the eye." There was silence on the other end. Then softer. "You remember what happened at Christmas, right?" I remembered. It was snowing that year, classic New England magic. I'd flown home after months of back-to-back product launches, emotionally wrung out but wanting to be part of the holiday of the family. I'd even brought personalized gifts for everyone, handmade leather tech organizers from a startup we'd partnered with engraved with each person's initials. They were opened and set aside within seconds. Later that evening during dinner, Dad stood up with a crystal glass in hand. "To Jason," he said, "for being promoted again this year. For representing the Morgan legacy with honor and excellence." Glasses clinked. Cheers rang out. I sat there smiling tightly, my cheeks burning. Not a single word. Not even a nod. When my mother brought out dessert, she leaned down and whispered, "You know your father struggles to express things." I nodded. But I didn't believe it anymore. Despite all that, I checked the box, "Will attend." I bought a dress. A Valentino structured, elegant, sharp at the seams, something my father might deem appropriate but still powerful. The color midnight blue. A hue that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. I booked a suite at the Four Seasons instead of staying at my parents' house. Not out of defiance, out of necessity. I needed space. Neutral ground. A place to retreat if things went. When the driver asked if I wanted to be dropped at the house for pre-dinner cocktails, I said no. "I'll meet them there," I said, smoothing the hem of my dress. I couldn't bear another hour of being invisible in my childhood home. That morning, Stephanie came by my office with coffee and a mini emergency kit lipstick, compact mints, a tiny perfume spray. "You don't owe them anything," she said, handing it over. "I know." "Then why do you look like you're about to walk into court?" "Because part of me still thinks this might be a hearing. One final ruling." Stephanie sat on the edge of my desk. "You've already won, Brit. You're not walking in there to earn their respect. You're walking in with your own." I sighed. "I want to walk out of that room feeling like I tried one last time." "Then do it," she said. "But set your own bar. Not theirs." That night, as I stood in front of the mirror, everything felt sharp. The dress. The eyeliner. The bone-deep awareness that I was stepping into a room where I'd never quite been invited, hoping maybe this time would be different. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to stop hoping altogether. I placed the gift I'd chosen into my bag, a rare first edition copy of the History of American Finance, one my father had once mentioned offhandedly as the last great book on the topic. It was a peace offering, maybe. Or maybe it was proof. I do listen, even when you don't. As I zipped my clutch, my phone buzzed. A text from Thomas, my CFO. "Update Tech Corp circling Datasphere again. We may need to counter sooner than planned. We'll keep you posted." I stared at the screen. Work didn't stop just because my father was blowing out candles, but tonight, I had told myself, was about family. Even if I was the only one trying to make it so. At 6:56 p.m., I stepped out of my car in front of Le Bernardin, heels clicking against the pavement, nerves rattling beneath practiced poise. As I handed my coat to the hostess and followed the maitre d', reminded myself, "You are not the girl they once overlooked. You are the woman they can no longer afford to ignore." I took one last breath before stepping through the doors into the test I didn't know would redefine everything. Le Bernardin was all soft light and quiet elegance, the kind of place where people spoke in hushed tones and the air smelled faintly of money and butter. The maitre d' smiled as I gave my name, then scanned his list. "Ah, yes. Miss Morgan. Your party has arrived." He led me through the main dining room, past glittering tables and the clinking of delicate cutlery. I could already see them, my family seated at the largest table in the center of the room. Dad at the head, gesturing animatedly with a glass of wine, Jason beside him, Amanda glowing at his side. Mom was laughing at something one of Dad's colleagues had said. The table radiated power. But the maitre d' didn't slow down as we approached. He veered to the right, away from them. I paused. "My family's there," I said, pointing. He turned to me, his face tightening. "I understand, Miss Morgan. But I was given specific instructions regarding your seating." He hesitated. "From Mr. Jason Morgan." A door opened to the restaurant's side patio. Quiet, half-lit. One table in the corner. One chair. One place setting. My heart dropped. "This must be a mistake," I said. The maitre d' looked genuinely pained. "I apologize." I'm only following the instructions I was given. I stepped out into the humid summer evening, the distant hum of traffic reminding me that the real world still existed just beyond the curated quiet of this place. And there it was, a small table mostly hidden behind a potted ficus partially blocked from the view inside. Like an afterthought. Like a mistake no one wanted to admit. The door behind me opened. I turned, hoping it was someone to fix the error. It was Jason. Champagne flute in hand, grinning like this was all terribly amusing. "There you are," he said. "Thought you might bail." "Why am I sitting out here?" He shrugged. "Space issue. Dad invited more partners than expected. We needed the main table for people actively involved in the conversation. The patio is what I asked. Overflow." He tilted his head. "For other guests. You know. The ones who aren't exactly central to the discussion." He said it with a smile, but I felt every barb. "You mean the patio is for failures," I said quietly. Jason raised his glass. "If the shoe fits." He turned and disappeared back inside. I sank slowly into the chair, heart pounding, but face composed. I'd spent a lifetime mastering the art of looking unbothered when you're breaking open inside. A waiter appeared, looking mortified. "Would you like something to drink, Miss Morgan?" I didn't even hesitate. "Yes," I said. "Bring me the most expensive bottle of Bordeaux you have. And don't be stingy with the poor." He blinked. "Of course. If I was going to be exiled, I might as well run up their bill." I sat there alone, swirling wine that cost more than my monthly rent back in our startup days, and looked through the glass doors. They were toasting. Dad was standing, giving some impassioned speech. The others leaned in, hanging on his every word. Jason, of course, was at his right hand. The golden sun. Amanda glowed beside him like she'd been cast in the role of banker's wife. Mom smiled like she had everything she ever wanted. And me, I was outside. Literally. Metaphorically. Completely. The candle on my table flickered. My food arrived, a delicate sea bass in lemon foam. It looked like something from a magazine. It tasted like nothing. I watched as one of Dad's partners gestured toward the patio. Dad looked in my direction, then waved the question away with a dismissive hand. The man nodded, laughed politely, and returned to his steak. I was invisible. Again. Still. The door opened. I turned. It was Mom. She stepped out, her face tight with guilt. She leaned down to kiss my cheek. "Brittany, darling. I'm so glad you're here." I said nothing. She glanced at the table, then back at me. "I told your father the seating was a mistake." I did. But you know how he is once he's made a plan, and with all his partners there. He didn't want to cause confusion. Or offense. I looked at her, calm but direct. "I'm not a guest at his table, Mom. I'm his daughter." She flinched. I know. I tried to." "It's fine," I said, cutting her off gently. "I'm used to being the afterthought." Her eyes welled, but she didn't deny it. "I'll come sit with you after the appetizers," she said softly. "No," I replied. "You won't." She touched my hand briefly. "We're glad you came." Truly. Then she disappeared back through the glass, back into the warmth, the comfort, the world where I had never belonged. I looked through the window again. They were laughing, raising glasses, sharing stories I wasn't part of. It was like watching a play I had never been cast in, no matter how many lines I memorized. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. I could keep showing up, hoping they'd scoot over, make space, let me in. Or I could accept it. This table, this story wasn't built for me. But I could build my own. One where I didn't have to ask to be seen. The waiter returned. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Miss Morgan?" I took a sip of the wine. Bold, sharp, unapologetic. "Yes," I said. "If I'm going to be forgotten, I may as well be drinking something unforgettable." My phone buzzed again. A second time. Then a third. I glanced down, only half expecting it to be from work. But it was. "Thomas. CFO urgent. TechCorp just submitted a formal offer. $1.4 billion all cash. Datasphere board meeting set for tonight. We need a counter within 90 mins. Their CEO wants to speak with you directly. Decision hinges on you. The blood drained from my face. I read it again and again. This wasn't just another shift in negotiations. This was the moment, the fulcrum on which everything we'd built could either balance or collapse. The deal we'd been cultivating for months, our single biggest strategic move, was being challenged. And the board of Datasphere wasn't just waiting. They were watching. For me. I stood from the table, instinctively taking my phone and stepping into the far corner of the patio. From there I could see both the skyline and the party I was pointedly excluded from. I called Thomas. He picked up on the first ring. "How bad is it?" I asked. "They came in strong," he said. "Clean deal. No contingencies. All cash. But we've got something they don't." "What's that?" he said. "Datasphere's CEO asked for you personally. He says our integration plan is smarter. But we need to move, now." I checked the time. 8:02 p.m. "Where's the meeting?" "They're landing in Manhattan at 10:30. They've booked the conference room at the Four Seasons. The board wants to hear our final offer by midnight." I paused, considered, calculated, and decided. "I'll be there," I said. "Tell legal to prep the counteroffer. We'll go up to 1.5 with the earnout structure we discussed." On it, Thomas replied. "Also, Britt, yeah, this is the one. Don't let it slip." I ended the call and turned around only to find Jason standing there. He'd been watching. Of course he had. "What, no boundaries now," he said, sipping his champagne. "Can't even pretend to care about Dad's birthday for one night." I slipped my phone into my clutch. "It's a business emergency." He scoffed. "Of course it is. Your little startup always seems to be in crisis mode." Before I could respond, the patio door opened again. My father stepped out, my mother a step behind. I braced myself. "Brittany," Dad said, that tone of restrained disappointment already loaded in his voice. "Your brother tells me you're conducting business during my celebration." "There's a time and place for everything," he added, adjusting his cufflinks. "In our world, business is done during business hours. Not at family events." "Your world," I said calmly, "has never included me." He frowned. "Don't be dramatic. It's a $1.5 billion acquisition, Dad. That's not drama. That's scale." He waved the number away like it was pocket change. "Whatever it is, it can wait. Tonight is about family." I looked around at the empty patio. "The table meant for one." "Is it?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, literally, it doesn't feel like I'm part of it." He stiffened. "If you walk out now, you're making a statement." "Yes," I said. "I am." Jason crossed his arms. "You always think you're the exception. That your work is more important than everyone else's." "No," I replied. "I just don't think my presence at this table matters to anyone but me." They said nothing. I took one step forward, shoulders squared. "I'm not leaving the middle of a family dinner," I said. I was never invited to sit at that table to begin with. And with that, I turned, walked to the edge of the patio, and texted Lucas, my pilot. "Need immediate pickup. Central Park 5 blocks away. Emergency meeting. ETA." The reply came seconds later. "Already nearby. I can land in 20. As I stepped back inside the restaurant to leave, heads turned. I could feel their eyes on me, not just my family but their friends, Dad's colleagues, the curated audience of his perfect life. My heels clicked against the marble floor like punctuation. Outside, the air was thick with the weight of summer and something else, freedom. I walked quickly, purposefully, toward Central Park. As I neared the clearing, the sky pulsed with distant light. The soft whoop 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 of rotor blades cut through the stillness. People were gathering on the sidewalk, pointing upward. A black helicopter emerged over the treetops, backlit by the city, the Nexus Technologies logo glowing faintly on its side. Wind rushed through the trees as it descended, stirring leaves, napkins, and conversations. From the restaurant windows above, silhouettes pressed against the glass. My father's guests, my brother, my mother, watching. Too late. The helicopter touched down in a perfectly executed landing. A member of the ground crew stepped forward, shielding me from the rotor wash. I didn't look back. Not at the restaurant. Not at the family table that had never saved me a seat. I climbed aboard. Thomas was already inside, laptop open. "We've got fresh projections and a revised offer," he said. "Sarah's patching in legal now." I nodded, fastening my seatbelt as we rose above Manhattan. From the air, the restaurant looked tiny. So did their table. So did their opinions. So did every time they told me I wasn't enough. It wasn't about the helicopter. It never was. It was about the moment I stood up from the table that had never welcomed me and flew toward the one I'd built myself. We landed on the rooftop helipad of the Four Seasons just past 10:30 p.m. The city below shimmered like it had secrets. The hum of helicopters, traffic, and neon life wrapped around us as I stepped onto the rooftop with Thomas at my side and wind in my hair. Inside, the conference suite had already been transformed into a war room. A dozen screens glowed with data, financial models, competitor maps, integration plans, projected revenues. Cables snaked across the floor. Coffee cups stood like sentries at each laptop. This was my battlefield. And tonight, I wasn't fighting to prove my worth to a family that refused to see me. I was here for something that mattered. "CEO's en route," Thomas said, handing me a revised deck. "They want to move quickly." "They're testing us," I said. "They're testing you," he corrected. I nodded, removing my coat. Underneath, I still wore my midnight blue Valentino, now wrinkled from the helicopter harness, but somehow more fitting than ever. I wasn't just walking in as a founder. I was walking in as the future partner they didn't see coming. At exactly 11:03 p.m., the elevator doors opened. Martin Hale, CEO of Datasphere, stepped out, flanked by his two top executives. He looked tired, sharp, and utterly focused. The kind of man who'd built something the hard way and knew what it cost. He walked toward me, extended a hand. "Brittany Morgan," he said. "I've heard a lot about you." "I'm guessing not from my family," I quipped. He chuckled. "No, from people I trust. People who say you're the real thing." I led him into the conference room, gesturing to a seat across from me. "We'll keep this direct," he said. Tech Corp's offer is on the table. $1.4 billion, clean, fast, all cash. "They're not buying your vision," I replied. "They're buying silence. Your silence." He tilted his head. "Go on. They want to acquire you so you stop being a threat. You're a competitor, an obstacle, a target." "And what are you?" he asked. I met his gaze. Steady. Clear. "I'm a builder. You've created something brilliant. We don't want to dissolve it. We want to amplify it." I clicked to the first slide of our integration roadmap. "Your analytics engine will be the foundation of our next-gen platform. Your team stays intact. Your leadership keeps full autonomy as a dedicated business unit." Martin raised an eyebrow. "And the numbers?" Thomas handed out the updated offer sheets. $1.65 billion, I said. $1.2 billion cash upfront. $450 million in Nexus equity. Accelerated payment schedule. No lockup period. Your executive team gets guaranteed roles with power. TechCorp offered 1.4 all cash. They'll gut your innovation within a year. "You know that," I said. "They'll rebrand it, absorb it, and shut down your R&D. You'll be a trophy. And you'll be forgotten." He leaned back, folding his arms. "You're trying to win this on values," he said. "Not just money." "I'm trying to win it on truth," I said. "You didn't spend 10 years building a company just to have it torn apart. You want legacy. You want impact. You want to build something that lasts longer than a press cycle." One of his executives leaned over to whisper something. He nodded slowly, then looked back at me. "What makes you think you can deliver all this?" he asked. "Because we've done it before," I said. "And because we're still hungry." I clicked to a final slide, a side-by-side comparison of our cultures, team dynamics, product visions. "We speak the same language, Martin," I said, my voice low but firm. "TechCorp wants to buy you to eliminate you. I want to partner with you to build something neither of us could do alone." He was quiet for a long moment. Then finally, "I have questions." "Good," I said. "Let's get to work." The next 4 hours were a storm of analysis, negotiation, back and forth, over terms, legal clauses, exit scenarios. Sarah patched in from legal, fielding questions at lightning speed. Our finance lead recalculated equity distribution on the fly. There were moments we stumbled, moments where fatigue almost cracked our focus. But we didn't break. Because this wasn't just about the deal. It was about what the deal represented. By 3:00 a.m. we were close. Martin walked to the window and looked out over the sleeping city. "I've been courted by bigger companies," he said quietly. "Flashier names. Longer histories." He turned back to face me. But none of them looked me in the eye and said, "Let's build the future together." He walked back to the table, extended his hand. "We have a deal." The room erupted in quiet, tired celebration. No champagne, no party. Just a team of people who had fought hard and won something that mattered. As legal began drafting the final paperwork, I stepped into the hallway. Alone. Breathing. Manhattan glowed below me, glass and steel and light. My phone buzzed. A text from Stephanie. "Heard the helicopter. Did you burn the whole place down or just their illusions?" I smiled. Then another message. From my mother. "Where are you? Are you okay? Your father is upset." And finally from Jason. "Was that really your helicopter?" I didn't respond. Not yet. There would be time for that later. Tonight belonged to the people who believed in me when no one else did. To the team that stayed up all night, night after night, building something from scraps of code and impossible dreams. To the girl who once sat outside with cold sea bass and a $900 glass of wine and chose to leave. By the time the sun rose, the deal was done. The final signatures had been inked at 4:17 a.m. and by 9:00 the press embargo lifted. Notifications exploded across my phone, emails, mentions, breaking news alerts. Wall Street Journal: Nexus CEO finalizes $1.65 acquisition. Leaves father's birthday in helicopter to close deal. Bloomberg. From patio to power move. Brittany Morgan's billion-dollar night. TechCrunch. She didn't have a seat at the table, so she bought the table. The coverage was relentless. Every outlet wanted a piece of the story, the gender, the spectacle, the symbolism. The headlines practically wrote themselves. And behind the spectacle there was a fact no one could deny: I'd led one of the biggest acquisitions in our sector that year. And I hadn't done it quietly. By mid-morning, my phone was flooded with messages. Some were from people I hadn't heard from in years. Old classmates. Investors who once passed on us. Executives who used to mistake me for the assistant in meetings. And then the messages I had expected. Mom, 1 missed call. Jason, 3 texts. Dad, 2 missed calls. I ignored them all for the moment. Because for once, I wasn't navigating their emotions. I was sitting in my corner office barefoot, sipping black coffee and watching the media cycle rewrite every narrative my family had ever believed about me. At 10:23 a.m., my assistant buzzed. "Your father is on line 1. He's being polite." I picked up. "Hi, Dad." A pause. Longer than expected. "Brittany," he said, finally, his voice even. "I saw the news. I figured." Another pause. "You really led this deal." I closed my eyes. "I always lead them, Dad. You just never asked." He cleared his throat, caught between pride and confusion. "Martin Hale called me," he said you were formidable." My lips curved. "Martin's generous. He fought hard. He said it was the most disciplined negotiation he'd ever sat through. That you never once lost focus." I waited. Let the silence do the work. "I didn't know your company had grown that much," he admitted. "I know," I said. He hesitated. "Then, why didn't you tell us?" "Because every time I tried," I said quietly, "you looked past it, or reduced it, or redirected the conversation to Jason." "That's not fair," he said reflexively. "It's not false either." Silence again. "I suppose," he said slowly, "I've been misinformed." "No," I replied. "You've been uninterested." He didn't argue. Later that afternoon, a delivery arrived at my office, a large bouquet of lilies, my mother's favorite, not mine. The card read, "Your father is stunned. We are all stunned. Call us when you're ready. Mom." I placed the card on the windowsill. Didn't toss it. Didn't answer either. That evening Stephanie swung by with takeout and wine. She dropped the bags on the kitchen counter and grinned. Okay, CEO. Let's talk about that landing. I raised an eyebrow. The deal or the helicopter? She burst out laughing. Both. But mostly the moment Jason realized your ride had a corporate logo on it. We sat on my sofa, shoes off, containers open, exhaustion still clinging to our bones like fog. She lifted her glass. To finally being seen, she said. I raised mine in return. To never needing them to see us in the first place. That night I lay in bed scrolling through headlines, seeing photos of myself I didn't know were taken. Blurred shots of me entering the park. Grainy footage of the helicopter. Zoomed in frames of my family staring through the restaurant window. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt finished. Not in a defeated way. In a resolved way. For years I had chased something from them that was never truly about me. Recognition, respect, visibility. But those things when forced become performance. What I wanted wasn't applause, I wanted acknowledgement. The kind that came unprompted, earned not extracted. And now that it was finally arriving, I realized it didn't matter as much as I thought it would. The next morning, Jason finally sent a message that wasn't a question or a dig. Jason, I read the WSJ piece. Congrats. That's legit impressive. Maybe I didn't see the full picture. No apology. No self-reflection. Just the faintest crack in the armor. I replied with a single word. Thanks. In the following days, I fielded interviews, congratulatory calls, analyst briefings. The stock price surged. Partners reached out. Our team, my real family, celebrated. My mother texted again. Your father is still processing. But he's proud. In his way. I smiled. That was the closest thing I'd ever get to an I was wrong from him. And maybe that was okay. Because I wasn't waiting at the window anymore, hoping to be invited in. I had flown above it. It started with a lunch invitation. Not a family dinner, not a holiday gathering. Just a quiet midweek lunch from my mother. Just us, she said on the phone. No pressure. I think we should talk. We met at a small cafe near my office. Casual, unthreatening. No white tablecloths or waiters in tuxedos. She was already there when I arrived, dressed more simply than usual, slacks instead of designer skirts, a soft knit sweater instead of her signature silk. When she looked up, there was something in her expression I hadn't seen in years. Nervousness. And underneath that, maybe even regret. You look good, she said, reaching for her water. Success agrees with you. I thanked her, keeping my tone neutral. She fidgeted with her napkin. Your father's still adjusting. I'm sure, I replied. She sighed, folded her hands. Then finally, I owe you an apology. I blinked. That wasn't a phrase I'd ever heard from her. Not once in my entire life. I should have said something, she continued. When you were seated outside, when Jason made those comments. When your father dismissed your work, I should have protected you. She looked up, eyes watery but steady. I didn't speak. I wanted to hear it all. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she said, but I've spent so much of my life smoothing things over. Keeping peace, avoiding conflict. And I told myself that was love. But I see now it wasn't strength, it was fear. That landed hard, because it was true. And yet it didn't sting the way it might have once. Not now, not after everything. She reached across the table, hesitated, then rested her hand lightly on mine. I didn't understand your world, Britt. So I stayed silent. And that silence hurt you. I see that now. For the first time in a long time, I believed her. Not because she said it perfectly, but because she didn't try to defend it. A week later, my father showed up at the office. Unannounced. My assistant buzzed, barely concealing her surprise. There's a Mr. Stephen Morgan here, says he doesn't have an appointment but would like to see the office. I stood slowly, heart strangely calm. Send him in. He walked in like a man entering unfamiliar territory. Suited, of course, but with less certainty than usual. His eyes scanned the space, the open layout, the team huddled around whiteboards, the glass conference rooms buzzing with quiet intensity. Impressive, he said. Very different. Different how he considered. Alive. Busy. Not what I expected. I guided him on a brief tour. Introduced him to our head of product, our CTO, the young intern whose eyes lit up when I said, "She's working on a core feature module." He nodded respectfully to each one. Asked a few questions. Nothing deep but more than polite. Finally, back in my office, he sat down across from me. "I've followed one model of success my entire life," he said. Harvard. Banking. Legacy. I thought that was the only path. He looked around. "This. What you've built. It's not what I would have chosen. But I can see now it has value. Real value." It wasn't an apology. But it was something. A beginning. Jason, of course, stayed silent. No texts, no calls, just digital distance layered over emotional vacancy. And for once I didn't care. I wasn't waiting. Not for him to admit he'd been cruel. Not for him to acknowledge the digs, the undermining, the relentless comparisons. I had stopped expecting anything from him the moment I climbed into that helicopter. And in that absence of expectation, I found something I hadn't known I needed. Peace. People often think healing happens in dramatic gestures. A public apology, a grand reconciliation. But for me it arrived quietly. In the pause between text messages. In the sunlight spilling across my desk during a normal Monday morning. In the way I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head that would never happen. I still spoke to my mother occasionally. We had lunch now and then. She asked real questions, listened. Didn't always understand, but no longer tried to reshape me into something more familiar. My father sent the occasional article with a note. "Thought this might interest you." It was awkward, but I appreciated the effort. I even let him attend one of our demo days. Watched as he stood in the back of the room, arms crossed but eyes alert. He clapped at the end. Not thunderous, not performative, just a slow, thoughtful clap. Enough. People around me said, it must feel good proving them wrong. But that's not what this was. Because the truth is proving them wrong was never the point. I didn't build Nexus to spite them. I built it because I believed in it. I left that dinner not to make a statement, but because I finally understood that waiting for someone else to validate your worth is the slowest form of self-erasure. And I was done erasing myself. Forgiveness didn't come all at once, and it didn't come because they changed. It came because I did. Because holding on to what they couldn't give me had begun to cost more than letting it go. So I let it go. Not for them. For me. 1 year later, I stood under the floodlights of the New York Stock Exchange ringing the opening bell. Nexus Technologies was officially public. The moment was surreal not because I didn't believe it would happen, but because I had stopped needing it to prove anything to anyone but myself. Our stock opened strong. The media called it a landmark day for women in tech. Journalists scrambled to cover my journey, throwing out every buzzword they could find: female founder, non-traditional path disruptor. And for once I didn't flinch at the labels. Because I knew who I was. That afternoon, I hosted a celebration not at some stuffy ballroom or inherited club but at the rooftop of our own headquarters. The people there weren't just colleagues, they were family. Stephanie raised her glass and said, to the woman who sat outside the glass, and then made her own skyscraper. Everyone laughed, cheered. But I didn't toast right away. Instead, I looked out over the skyline. The buildings. The movement. The thousands of lives unfolding below. And somewhere down there, just a few city blocks away, was a restaurant called Le Bernardin. I could still see the patio in my mind. The lonely table. The untouched dessert. The reflection of a woman wondering if she'd ever belong. I walked to the edge of the rooftop, the wind tugging at my sleeves. The city glittered like it had something to say. And maybe it did. Because the truth was, I never needed them to pull out a chair. I didn't need their permission. I didn't need their version of success. I had built something far greater than a seat at their table. I had built the entire room. And filled it with people who saw me clearly. A young intern joined me at the Ledge Marisol, fresh out of a state college, the first in her family to graduate. She had ideas I'd never dreamed of, questions no one else dared ask. "Do you ever get used to this?" she asked. Eyes wide, voice barely louder than the breeze. Used to what I said, smiling. To being the one everyone looks up to, I paused. Thought of every late night. Every slammed door. Every comment about playing CEO. No, I said. And I hope I never do. She looked confused. If you get used to it, you forget how hard it was to get here, I said. And you stop making room for the next woman behind you. Later that evening, I stayed behind when the crowd had thinned, just me and the lights of a city that had once felt too big to conquer. I walked to the corner of the rooftop where we kept a single chair. It was wooden. Simple, unassuming. I'd asked our team to bring it up the day we hit our 1 millionth user. Not just any chair. The same design as the one from the patio that night. The night everything changed. I sat in it now, not out of pain but in reverence. Because I wanted to remember. Not the rejection, but the rise. The wind picked up again. My phone buzzed with new messages, speaking invitations, podcast requests, a note from a young founder in Kenya thanking me for being visible. I didn't open any of them right away. Instead, I closed my eyes and breathed in the quiet. Not the silence of being excluded, but the stillness of knowing you no longer need to prove anything. Voiceover, final monologue. If you're watching this, maybe you've known the ache of sitting at a table where no one sees you. Maybe you've been asked to shrink, to soften, to wait your turn. Or maybe, just maybe, you've been told that success only looks one way. Their way. But here's the truth. If you're sitting at a table not meant for you, stand up, walk away, and build your own. You don't need their chair. You are the architect of your future. You are the table. You are the room. And when you're ready, fly. In a way only you can.